I never thought a quiet life by the lake could turn into something like this, something that slowly pulls you into conflict just because you chose to stay in a place you already called home long before anyone else decided it needed to be improved, managed, or controlled. My name is Evelyn Hart, and I have lived in a small brick cottage on the edge of Larkspur Lake for almost 9 years now. It is not impressive in the way people usually mean it. No modern architecture, no luxury finishes, just an old house with a wraparound porch, a slightly uneven wooden dock, and a garden that my late husband and I planted together before life took him away from me. That garden was never meant to be perfect, just alive, changing with the seasons, a reminder that not everything needs to be corrected to be valuable. For years, that was my entire world: quiet mornings with coffee on the porch, the sound of water moving gently against the dock, and the kind of silence that feels earned, not empty. Then the development came. It started with trucks you barely notice at first, then fences, then survey markers, and suddenly there was a name for everything around me: Ridgewater Estates, a gated lakeside community built around polished promises and expensive symmetry. The houses were beautiful in a way that felt rehearsed: identical mailboxes, trimmed hedges, rules printed in neat fonts about what kind of life was acceptable inside their boundary lines. I was not part of it, not legally, not socially, not even remotely. My property had existed decades before their blueprint was drawn, but that never seemed to matter to them. That was when the problems started, small at first, almost laughable. The first time I met the HOA president, her name was Cassandra Vale. She came up my driveway without asking, clipboard in hand, wearing a tailored coat, like she was inspecting a corporate property instead of stepping onto someone's private home. She smiled politely, but it never reached her eyes. She told me my wind chimes were not compliant with community sound standards. I remember actually pausing because I thought she was joking. Then she told me my garden ornaments created visual inconsistency with the lakeside aesthetic. I asked her what that meant exactly, and she said it like it was obvious, that my property should blend into the collective identity of the community. That was the moment I realized she wasn't suggesting anything. She was assuming authority over something she had never been given. I told her as calmly as I could that my property was independent, that I had no contract with their association, and she simply nodded like she had heard that excuse before and didn't find it interesting. After that, she kept coming back, different complaints each time. My shutters were the wrong shade of white. My garden fence was too rustic. Even the placement of my porch chairs was apparently disruptive to visual harmony. I started ignoring her after a while, which I think bothered her more than any argument ever could. But the real shift happened one summer afternoon when I came home and immediately felt that something was wrong before I even opened the door. The air inside was heavy, still, unnatural. I stepped in and realized everything was off. No lights, no refrigerator hum, no air conditioning, just silence pressing into the walls. At first I thought it was a simple outage, a breaker issue, something I could fix in minutes, but the panel was fine. So I called the electric company expecting a routine answer, and that was when everything changed. They told me my service had been disconnected under a shared community utility account managed by Ridgewater Estates. I remember standing there holding the phone, not fully understanding what I was hearing because none of it made sense. I had never signed anything, never agreed to anything, never even received anything that suggested I was part of their system. I said that clearly, and the person on the line hesitated, like they were suddenly aware this was not a normal case. That hesitation stayed with me more than anything else. I drove straight to the Ridgewater Estates office, and I remember gripping the steering wheel harder the closer I got, not out of rage yet, but out of the strange realization that someone had made a decision about my life without ever asking me if they could. The office looked like every HOA office does when it wants to feel important: glass doors, polished floors, soft lighting, and silence that felt curated. And there she was, Cassandra Vale, sitting behind her desk with the kind of calm that only comes from believing you are untouchable. I told her my power had been cut, and the electric company said it was under their shared account system. I asked her what she had done. She didn't react immediately, just took a slow sip of her drink, and then gave me a smile that felt rehearsed. She told me the community had consolidated utilities to streamline billing and that my property had been included under an extended jurisdiction overlay. I remember repeating the words in my head because they sounded like legal language but felt like fiction. I told her again, slower this time, that I was not part of her HOA. She tilted her head slightly and said technically my property fell within their management boundary and that notices had been sent. That was the moment something inside me shifted from confusion into focus, because I realized this was not just a misunderstanding. It was a system being used incorrectly and confidently enough that it was starting to feel real. And I also realized that if I didn't understand exactly how far this went, I was going to lose more than just my electricity. And that was when I started paying attention to everything they had built, not just the rules they enforced, but the structure underneath them that they assumed no one would ever question. Part 2. I left that office without saying another word. But I was no longer thinking like someone trying to resolve a problem. I was thinking like someone trying to understand a system that had just been used against me without permission. There is a strange clarity that comes when you realize you are not dealing with emotion anymore, but with structure, because structure can be studied, and anything that can be studied can eventually be understood. I went home and pulled every document I had ever received related to my property: the deed, old tax records, utility statements, survey maps from when the land was first divided decades ago. My house had existed long before Ridgewater Estates was even planned, long before their gates and their aesthetic rules and their idea of controlled lakeside living. Nowhere in my history was there any legal connection to their association. So I started digging deeper into county zoning records, utility provider agreements, and subdivision filings. That is when I found the first real contradiction. Ridgewater Estates did have a shared utility agreement, but it only applied to their officially registered subdivision properties and common infrastructure like street lighting, clubhouse power, and gate systems. My property was never included in that agreement. Yet somehow, during a back-end consolidation with the electric provider, my address had been absorbed into their umbrella account ID. It was not a legal transfer, it was an administrative linkage error, but in utility systems those errors can become operational realities very quickly. Because once a property is inside an umbrella account, billing authority follows the account structure, not the intention behind it. And that meant something very important, something I don't think Cassandra Vale had fully understood when she triggered it. If the HOA did not formally request removal of my property from the umbrella account, the provider could not unilaterally separate it without restructuring the entire agreement. I called the electric company again, this time asking for their legal department directly, asking very specific questions about account integrity and shared utility responsibility. There was a long pause, and then confirmation, quiet and careful, that as long as Ridgewater Estates maintained the umbrella structure and did not file for separation, my property would remain inside the system and billing would continue through their account holder. I remember sitting at my kitchen table after that call, listening to the refrigerator turn back on like nothing had ever been wrong, and realizing something that felt almost uncomfortable in its simplicity. They had tried to take control of my power, but in doing so they had accidentally tied themselves to every watt of energy my house consumed. And I don't think Cassandra Vale understood yet that the moment she chose convenience over accuracy, she had created a responsibility she could not quietly undo. Part 3. The first call came 2 weeks later. And I could hear the shift in her voice immediately, not anger exactly, but something more unsettling, uncertainty trying to disguise itself as authority. Cassandra Vale told me there was a billing discrepancy and that my property was showing up on the Ridgewater Estates utility account in a way that was affecting their community budget. I didn't respond right away. I just let her talk, because I had learned something important about people like her. They tend to reveal more when they are trying to maintain control of a conversation they are no longer fully leading. Finally, I said calmly that there was no discrepancy, only continuation of the system they had created. I reminded her that my property had been included under their umbrella account, and that removal required formal separation filing with the provider. She tried to interrupt, but I continued, not louder, just steadier, explaining that any attempt to disconnect me would require restructuring their entire utility agreement and likely trigger financial penalties they had not planned for. There was silence after that, longer than before, and I could almost picture her sitting there realizing that the simplicity she had relied on was gone. Over the following months, the situation settled into something almost surreal. Each billing cycle, Ridgewater Estates received an electric bill that included my home's usage, and each time they paid it, because the alternative was dismantling their shared utility system entirely. Cassandra tried different approaches, emails framed as formal notices, phone calls that started polite and ended tight, even vague legal threats about unauthorized use of community resources. But every time, the conversation returned to the same point. The system was real, it was theirs, and I was inside it in a way that could not be erased without cost. I never celebrated it, not really. There was nothing loud about it, no confrontation, no dramatic victory moment. Just a quiet reversal where the rules they had used to control others became the same rules that now bound them. And sometimes I think about how easily all of this could have been avoided if someone had simply checked the structure before acting on assumption. Because in the end, what changed everything was not revenge and not anger, but the fact that someone underestimated how much damage a small mistake in system design can actually create when it meets someone who refuses to disappear quietly. And I still wonder, if you were in my place, would you have stopped it early or followed it all the way to the end just to see who actually controlled the switch? I drove straight to the Ridgewater Estates office with a kind of silence in my head that didn't feel calm. It felt focused, like everything emotional had already burned through on the way there, and what was left was just the part of me that needed answers. The kind of anger you don't show anymore, because it would only get in the way of understanding what someone actually did to you. The office sat just beyond their gated entrance, clean stone walls, glass panels, security cameras angled like they were designed more for intimidation than protection. Everything about it looked orderly in a way that felt rehearsed, like the whole place had been built to convince people that questioning it would be unreasonable. And there she was, Cassandra Vale, sitting behind her desk with a kind of calm that didn't feel natural anymore once you knew what she had done. I told her my electricity had been shut off, and that the utility company said it was tied to their HOA system. I asked her directly what authority she had used to do that. She didn't react the way I expected. No surprise, no hesitation, just a slow sip of her drink like she had time to spare. Then she explained, very smoothly, that Ridgewater Estates had recently consolidated all lakeside utility accounts under a shared billing structure to streamline community services, and that my property had been included under an extended zoning and management interpretation. I remember standing there trying to make sense of how she was using administrative language like it was a kind of shield, as if saying the right combination of words could turn private property into something collective without consent. I told her again, slower this time, I am not part of your HOA. I never signed anything. You cannot just decide that for me. She leaned back slightly and said technically my property fell within their management boundary and that notices had been issued to all affected properties. That word, affected, stayed in my head because it framed me like a condition instead of a person. That was when something inside me shifted away from emotion and into observation, because I realized this wasn't just arrogance, it was reliance on a system they believed no one would challenge. I left without raising my voice, but my mind was already breaking everything apart, not emotionally, structurally. At home I gathered every document I had, my deed, old county surveys, utility bills, anything that defined the legal history of my land. My cabin had existed long before Ridgewater Estates was even planned, long before their gates and rules and curated aesthetic identity. There was no legal bridge between us, nothing that placed my property under their authority. So I started digging deeper into county records, zoning archives, and utility provider agreements. And that is where I found the first real inconsistency. Ridgewater Estates did have a shared utility system, but it only applied to their registered subdivision units and common infrastructure like street lighting, clubhouse power, and gate operations. My property was not listed anywhere in that agreement. Yet somehow, during a back-end consolidation with the electric provider, my address had been absorbed into their umbrella account ID, not by legal transfer, but by system linkage, an administrative error that became operational once it was accepted by the billing structure. And that is where the situation changed direction completely, because in utility systems like that, once an account structure exists, it defines responsibility unless formally corrected, which meant if Ridgewater Estates did not file for separation, the provider would continue treating all linked properties as part of the same billing entity. I called the electric company again, this time asking for legal clarification instead of customer service answers, asking how umbrella accounts were enforced, asking what would happen if a non-member property remained inside the structure. There was a pause on the line that lasted long enough to feel like someone was realizing the weight of what they were confirming. Then they said it clearly, as long as Ridgewater Estates maintained the umbrella agreement and did not formally remove my property through the proper filing process, the account would remain intact and billing responsibility would continue under the HOA system. I remember sitting at my kitchen table after that call, listening to the quiet return of normal life around me, the refrigerator humming again, the air settling back into movement, and realizing something that felt both simple and unsettling at the same time. They had tried to take control of my power without understanding that in doing so, they had inserted themselves into the mechanism that controlled it. And whether Cassandra Vale understood it yet or not, she had created a system where removing me now required more effort than leaving me in place, and that kind of mistake doesn't stay small for long. The second time Cassandra Vale called me, I already knew something had shifted, not in me, but in her. It wasn't obvious at first. She still had that same controlled tone, still tried to sound like she was managing a normal administrative issue, but there was a tension underneath it now, like she was speaking from inside a system that wasn't behaving the way she expected anymore. She told me there was a billing irregularity affecting Ridgewater Estates, and that my property was still appearing under their shared utility account in a way that was becoming, in her words, problematic for the association. I didn't interrupt her. I just let her talk, because I had learned something important about conversations like this. The more control someone thinks they have, the more information they tend to reveal without realizing it. When she finished, I said calmly that there was no irregularity, only continuity of the structure they had created. I reminded her that my property had been included under their umbrella utility account, and that removal required formal separation filing with the provider, something that could not be done casually or verbally. She tried to push back immediately, saying again that I was not a member of the HOA and therefore could not remain in their system. That was when I explained, very evenly, that membership was not the issue anymore, system linkage was, and once a property is inside a utility umbrella account, responsibility follows structure, not intent. There was a pause after that, longer than the ones before, and I could almost feel the moment where her confidence stopped being automatic and started becoming something she had to actively maintain. Over the next few weeks, the situation settled into something almost unreal in its simplicity. Each month, Ridgewater Estates received an electric bill that included my home's usage, and each month, they paid it. Not because they wanted to, not because they agreed with it, but because the alternative required dismantling their entire shared utility agreement and rebuilding it from scratch with the provider, something that carried financial penalties and regulatory complications they clearly had not anticipated when they consolidated everything in the first place. Cassandra tried to regain control in different ways. First came formal emails framed like policy reminders, then phone calls that started with forced politeness and slowly tightened into frustration, then vague references to legal review and unauthorized use of community infrastructure. But none of it changed the core issue. The system they had created was still active, and I was still inside it in a way they could not quietly reverse. And what made it worse for them was that I wasn't attacking them. I wasn't escalating anything. I wasn't even arguing anymore. I was simply existing inside the structure they had defined and letting it function exactly as designed. I think that's what finally unsettled her, because people like Cassandra are used to conflict, they are used to resistance, they are used to situations where someone pushes back so they can push harder. But this wasn't that. This was a closed loop they couldn't step out of without admitting the mistake that created it. 12 months passed like that, quiet on the surface, almost boring if you didn't understand what was happening underneath it. Ridgewater Estates continued paying the bill. My house continued receiving power, and the association continued trying to maintain the appearance of control over a system that had quietly stopped obeying their assumptions. And sometimes I would sit on my porch at night looking out at the lake and think about how fragile authority really is when it depends on nobody reading the details too closely. Because in the end, nothing dramatic collapsed. There was no confrontation that resolved everything in a single moment. No public defeat, no dramatic apology. Just a slow realization on their side that the structure they built had rules they didn't fully understand, and once those rules were activated, they applied to everyone equally, including them. And I still think about Cassandra sometimes. Not as an enemy, but as someone who built a system expecting it would only ever move in one direction, not realizing that systems don't care who started them once they're already running.